Let's give a warm pachyderm welcome to Professor Ken Spurgeon.
Good afternoon. I recognize several familiar faces and a bunch of familiar faces in the back of the room. I taught at Northfield for a while, for about 10 years actually, so several of these young people have been my students. And I'm a big believer in grammar, logic, and rhetoric too. So I'm going to give a talk about Kansas during the territorial period of Bleeding Kansas, but I'm going to focus a bit on the Underground Railroad in Kansas. And I'll tell you guys that I've been talking and teaching Kansas history for about 25 years. I'm teaching it this semester, actually at Friends. And until about 2 years ago, I never really gave a talk about the Underground Railroad in Kansas. In fact, this talk I'm giving today, this kind of version, I've only given a couple of times. So I gave it Monday in Sumner County Historical Society, and I told them, be kind to me, because I said this is the maiden voyage of this talk. I do a lot of talking about Bleeding Kansas, and the book that I wrote that's the primary era. But like I said, the Underground Railroad in Kansas is it's an unknown story in many ways. So we're going to talk about it today. And I know my time is a little shorter, so there'll be a few of these slides I'll just kind of go through quickly, because I really want you to hear the story of freedom, which is an important story all time, always. And I want you to hear that story and on the plains of Kansas. So normally when I'm teaching, I tell my students, you got to understand this map to understand the 19th century. This is the Missouri Compromise, and the idea of slavery was already a problem because we didn't deal with it at the founding, as you all know. And then over time, some states, as we see here, the states in green had outlawed it. The states in red had not outlawed it. That did not mean everybody in those places was for or against or owned or didn't own. But it did set up a situation where, of course, two sections were being created, which we call sectionalism. But in 1820, they came to the issue of Missouri, which we can see the geographical location of Missouri and realize that Missouri is a challenge because it's not really in the north and it's not really in the south. And so when the Missouri Compromise occurred, this was the moment that the first real national discussion over ending slavery or continuing slavery occurred. And what they decided was that Missouri would come in as a slave state. Maine, we know where Maine is at, but at that time, Maine was like the woods of nothingness, owned by Massachusetts, by the way. Maine was Massachusetts. So they decided Maine would come in as a free state. Missouri is a slave state, Maine is a free state. And then supposedly, from this point on, the 3630 line, the latitudinal line, 50 miles south of us here, would be the dividing line for the future. Supposedly, to the north it'd be free, to the south would be slave. That chilled things out for 34 years. It wasn't a great answer, but it was the answer. It was the compromise of the time. Of course, the problem is the area to the north is unorganized, which is where we are now. The area to the south is owned by Spain, later Mexico, when Mexico throws off Spain. 30 years later, after the Mexican War, after the Texas Revolution, the other way around, but after those were over, they had another discussion. And by this point, we've got California that has emerged and is a state, the 49ers, gold rush and all. And we've also got, at this point at least, if nowhere else, in Utah, the Mormons have gone out there, and that is a beginning process. So 1850 is the first time we hear the phrase popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means the will of the people. It wasn't really acted upon, but it was spoken. If you looked at this map closely, Utah and New Mexico territory, which are very large, were supposedly popular sovereignty. Let me say more about that because it has everything to do with Kansas. So the idea of the will of the people sounds great, can be great. The problem is, as John Adams said, it can also be chaos. If it doesn't have law, if it doesn't have a process, it's direct democracy, which can be great, but it can be challenging. Well, so they introduced that idea here, but nothing really happens. There's not enough settlement in those areas. Nothing really happens. 4 years later, this is the act that created us. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was authored by Stephen Douglas, who some people call the Little Giant, a 5'4", robust guy with a fantastic voice, very charismatic, a Democrat from Chicago. He suggested the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and while he didn't care about slavery, I would define him somewhat as ambivalent to slavery. He had national aspirations, and if you had national aspirations, you didn't want to upset the South. That was a big area, big region, etc. So Douglas authors this, and he takes the popular sovereignty idea and he moves it. You can see here, if you look at that orange, now it's in Kansas, Nebraska, Utah, and New Mexico. And you can see these are territorial spaces. I joke with my students, this is the era when you could ski Kansas because Denver was in Kansas territory, right? The old days. And it's pretty cool because about 2 years ago, somebody came to school, an older person who'd had me in WSU's class, lifelong learning or something. He said, I got something you've never seen. It was an original a piece of mail that was addressed from like New York to Denver, Kansas from 1855. And I was like, that is super cool. And I don't know how many of those exist, but those, so, of course, we realize what can and can't be regulated and legislated, et cetera, over time. But anyway, this is what sets off what we know as Bleeding Kansas. Because popular sovereignty, and you've just now said that whoever gets there wins. So, just a minute on that. Bringing someone from Michigan who's never seen a slave and having them settle next to someone from Mississippi who brings 25 is going to be a collision like none other. The guy from Mississippi says, it's my business, leave me alone. And the guy from Michigan, who may have not even cared that much before, he kind of cares now. It's a lot. So then we have, of course, once you have a territory, and I know you guys talk about elections a lot, but once we have a territory, we have to have elections. And again, I'm kind of doing this quickly. Our first elections were held in 1855. Who gets to vote? Do you have to show any kind of ID? No. Do you own land? Probably not, or maybe not. And then, as I tell my students, if you want to really see voter fraud, come to Kansas Territory because I got a lot for you of all kinds. It's like the think tank of voter fraud because probably, we'll never know, but we've probably got ballot box stuffing. We've probably got voting in multiple precincts. But what happens is the elections are held, and as all the settlers look around, and of course we'll get a little bit into Lawrence and stuff in a minute, but as the settlers look around, most of them say, hey, it looks like most of us are free staters. Most of us are free staters. But the election results come back, and guess what? The pro-slavery candidates have won by a large number. So free staters immediately say, no way is this legal. This could not be correct. And so they'll say bogus. They'll also try to create their own government. But the pro-slavery government that just won the first territorial election, those results go to Washington. President Franklin Pierce signs on them. And as one of my mentors, Dr. Miner, always used to say, what is legal is not always what's right, and what's right is not always what's legal. And I always thought that stuck with me because, here we are, right? So the pro-slavery government, it may have happened fraudulently. No, it happened fraudulently. I didn't tell you some results. The election results of the first territorial election, we had 2,000 more voters than we had people in Kansas Territory. There you go. So you know how you guys get results and then, hey, we had 65% turnout, we had 73% turnout. You're not supposed to have 144% turnout. That's a problem, right? So there's again, how it happened. So that system of irregularities creates a pro-slavery government that gets seated and legal over here. And then the free staters, like I said, they say bogus, and they go to Topeka and try to create their own state legislature. So they're illegal, even if they have the right ideas, they're illegal. To make it more challenging, this is what got everybody also stirred up in the 1850s. And you guys all know, this is the right room to say this, The Republican Party is created out of a response of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That is the creation of the Republican Party because they're mad about it. They're also mad about this, which is the fugitive slave law. A lot of people in those days said, what you do is your business, which we understand. This is what really worked a lot of people up because the fugitive slave law, we had several, but they redid it in 1850. Basically said if a slave ran away, no matter where he was or she was, their owner could always come get him. So if that had been 30 years, whatever. What about the owner? What if the owner died? The owner's children could come get him. Slaves were property. That's the way the court saw it. This upset a lot of people because a lot of these former slaves ended up in the North, and then people showed up. We have several stories of 10 white men showing up and grabbing 3 people out of a small town. And the problem with this is, well, it's problematic in a lot of ways, but also we forget we have a lot of free blacks. So certainly a lot of free blacks that never had been even enslaved were getting grabbed. So this angered a lot of people, South and North, mostly North. Okay, well, back to Kansas Territory for a second. This is messy. And again, one of those things I'll only spend 1 minute on because it takes the time. We had 4 territorial constitutions. This is we try. Number 1 is the Topeka one, as far as just chronologically. First kind of like, hey, we've got one. This is what you had to do to become a state. So round number 1 is pushed forward by the Topeka Free Staters, which again, they're out of line because they didn't get elected, but they believe they're representing us. So they send one forward. That's not going to pass. That one would have had freedom. Again, what's going to happen to Kansas? Are we going to go free state? Are we going to go pro-slavery? So that one doesn't pass. The next one almost passed, and this one was the scariest. This is the Lecompton Constitution, and if you've never been to Lecompton, you should go to Lecompton, because Lecompton was convinced they were going to win. This was the pro-slavery body. It enacted probably the harshest territorial slave code in the United States. If you were a white person and you aided a slave, you could be executed. Not in jail, which was the fugitive slave law. They stepped it up another notch. So this one was pretty scary. It laid a lot of harsh, like I said, slave codes out there. It didn't pass, thankfully. Then they go to Leavenworth. Well, Leavenworth tried to push back harder. Leavenworth said not only did we say no slavery, Leavenworth's Constitution, which in some parts was really good, they said, hey, guess what? All males vote. What? Yeah, all African American males. Well, that wasn't going to pass. So finally, Wyandotte is authored in 59. And guys, it wouldn't even have passed, but the Civil War began. What happened? Actually, the Civil War didn't begin. Secession began. And when some states exited 8 days before we became formally a state, it passed. January 21st. At that point, you'd already had 5 or 6 states secede from the Union in response to Lincoln's election. Lincoln has not been inaugurated yet, but he's been elected. So that's how we finally became a state. There's a great photograph, and I didn't put it in here because I'm moving on, but there's a great photograph of people gathered around Abraham Lincoln's house in Springfield, Illinois, and somebody's holding a sign, big sign, and it says, "Let us in, Kansas." It's just, they're walking around like, "Let us in." It's a cool sign because I always thought there's so much going on at that moment that's unbelievable. So what did these settlers, when they got here, see? What they saw for the first time was slavery for many of them. What did these free staters see? So I take a little story from the book that I wrote because it's a story I know well. The book I wrote was about 2 Swiss immigrants who came to America. They came separately because they meet in St. Joseph, Missouri. Christian, the male, he came to America in the 1830s with his family. And then in the 1850s, 1854, he comes to St. Joe, Missouri. He actually originally tried to go to cross the line, but he ends up in St. Joe, Missouri. And then Elise, his future wife, she comes in 1854, straight from Switzerland. And neither one of them had seen any slavery. Christian had lived in Ohio before he came here. In fact, his family were Democrats. In fact, they were what I'd call copperheads. They were peace Democrats, but they were copperheads, which were people who tried to almost straddle the line. So Christian comes out here, and of course, I went through all of his writings and everything, and he's a lot of self-educated man, but he didn't have a lot of, classroom learning. But he says in his early letters, I'm a staunch Democrat. In fact, he says I'm a Buchanan guy. He later says, that I'm a Stephen Douglas guy for a minute. But what happens is when he gets to the Kansas territory, his eyes are like, whoa, he sees slavery. Elise is the one that's the most, touching when you read what she had to say. The heart of a mother, a future mother. By the way, she was 17 years old. The story I'm going to tell you, she wrote when she was 17. So they met each other in St. Joe. He was a carpenter. They rented a house from what she later called a secessionist. And she said, right after I got there, I realized, there's slave sales going on here. Not just slavery, slave auctions. And Elise writes in her letter, it broke my heart every Saturday. Every Saturday morning was the slave auction right down the street from where they lived. Well, she said one morning, this would be 1861, summer of 1861, the Civil War starting. And Christian's trying to figure out what he wants to do. But she said one morning, all of a sudden, I got up, I made my breakfast, and I heard screaming. She said, this morning I thought, I got to see why there's so much screaming today. She said, I dipped out of my house, and I looked down the street, and I saw on the dais a black woman with her arm outstretched to a 10 or 12-year-old black boy. And she said, I realized she's not screaming because she's being sold. She's screaming because her son has just been sold to someone else. She's about to lose her child. And Elise said, I went back inside the house, and she said, while that woman screamed inside, I screamed lamentations. Or while she screamed outside, I screamed lamentations inside. And I swore to God, if there was anything I could do to end this awful institution, I would do it. She later said, I wish they'd give me a uniform. I'd kill somebody. She was that serious about it. 17-year-old girl, sweet woman. By the way, I'm not going to talk about the Isleys anymore, but I want you to know they later came to Wichita, if you didn't know that. And their oldest son went to Harvard and was the first dean of Fairmount College, Wichita State. So I'd heard of the later story. That's why the book was about the early story of the parents. But my point is, that's what people started to see. That's what people started to see. Well, they knew about the Underground Railroad. Certainly in the East, which was, of course, as I say here, slaves, passengers, conductors, and station masters. I made the joke Monday night that when I was a little boy, I remember the first time I heard about the Underground Railroad, and I think I was interested in trains. My dad was a pilot, and I remember coming into the house probably when I was 7, and I said, I don't understand how they're traveling underground. And my dad said, they're not. That's how they're traveling underground. They're not. But I was just like, wow, how's that working? I mean, I probably was thinking, is it a subway? I mean, what's happening? But it really had very much the idea of a route for sure and all that. One thing we want to always do when we're talking about the Underground Railroad is never forget the agency of African Americans. In other words, we don't want it to sound like it was them waiting to be saved. And I take this from Frederick Douglass. And if you've never read much Frederick Douglass, please read some Frederick Douglass. Because Frederick Douglass talks about that. Of course, he was, in many ways, the most famous runaway of the 19th century. I'm going to really briefly tell you his story if you don't know it. He ran away when he was about 18 or 19 from a really harsh owner. He got away. He understood the fugitive slave law. He understood the dollar amount, the pay bills that would go out that would say $200 if you can find slave named Frederick or whatever. Frederick Douglass got the money, earned the money, and sent a check to his owner and said, this is in payment for one slave named Frederick. Don't come looking for me. He bought himself. And his career every day after that, when he gave all those great talks, when he became that great speaker, Frederick Douglass could get up and say, there's nobody looking for me. I own me. I bought me. He wanted to be able to say that. I want to tell you a story from our area. It's a great story, a sad, sad story, but it tells you this challenge. I just told you, if a white person got involved in rescuing, they could be punished severely, right? So this story happened around Kansas City. And I just mentioned to you, St. Joe and Weston and a couple of towns on the Missouri side were pretty active slave trading locations, sadly. I love Weston, Missouri. It's one of my favorite towns. But those were terrible slave trading areas right at this time. Well, people did know, because the Underground Railroad was talking like, here's a safe person, there's a safe person, whatever. That's how it worked, word of mouth. Well, there was a blacksmith, and he was known to be a helper. He was an anti-slavery man on the Missouri side, but he was known to be a helper. This is a story he told. One night, in the middle of the night, heard a knock at the door. He went to the door, and standing in front of him was about a 40-year-old black man. He said, the man said, I know who you are, help. So, his mind went into work like, I don't know what I got to do. I got to get him to somebody. I got to get him to a horse. Got to get him out of here. You'll learn here in a minute, the real route out is to go all the way to Canada because of this fugitive slave law. It's not just go to a northern state, it's go to Canada. Well, this blacksmith, white man, he looked at the African-American man and he said, I scanned him, and when I got to his feet, I saw shackles. His feet were tied together. He was shackled at his foot. Can't get on a horse. So he said, my next reaction was, I can't get him on a horse. He said, then the man pointed down at his shackles and he said, cut him off. You see, you know why he went to a blacksmith. That was the man who could cut him off. So he said, we got him inside, and I set him in a chair, and I pulled his feet up, and he said, then I realized, I don't know how many years he had him on him, but his skin had grown around the shackles. Like a tree. You know what I'm talking about. He said, I told him, if I cut those off, you'll be dead in a week or two from infection, from gangrene. And he said, the man said, cut him off. So we cut him off. He then took him out he barely could walk, but he said he took him out to the stables. They put him on a horse, and I said goodbye. He said, then, because of the situation, because of the fugitive slave law, I went out to the pasture and I buried him. I buried the shackles. I buried any evidence that he had ever been there. When the war was over, that man dug him up, relocated to Wichita, and those shackles are now at the Kansas State Historical Society and Collections. That's where that story actually comes from. But those are how many hundreds and thousands of stories are like that, right? So in Kansas, abolitionists were rising. Not all free staters were alike, and I've already talked a little bit about the dangers of assisting. And what everybody really was concerned about was the aspect of the violence of it all. We had the violence that was sometimes almost political and separate from specific, like rescues, right? But what did start to happen by 1855 and 1856 is that free staters realized that if they were going to stand up, they were going to have to stand up physically. Elise said, I wish I could do something about it. And in Kansas, because of things like the burning and sack of Lawrence, the first one, which is May 21st, 1856, something was going to have to break. I have to do this quick. A series of significant events happened here. May 21st, Lawrence was sacked for the first time by a Missouri pro-slavery mob. Burned. This is not the Quantrill raid of later where almost 200 people were killed. But a day later, Charles Sumner, an early Republican, Charles Sumner gave a 2-day address called The Crimes Against Kansas. Dr. Miner, one of his last books, was talking about how Kansas was in the news every day in 1856. It absolutely was in every newspaper because, how's this going to turn out? Well, Sumner gives this very huge speech where he calls out some Southerners who have defended slavery. And you guys probably know the next day, Preston Brooks slips into the Senate and beats Sumner almost to death. They thought Sumner was dead, but this is called the caning of Sumner. So, things are amping up. 2 days later, so May 21st, sack of Lawrence, May 22nd, Sumner's speech. May 23rd, Sumner's beaten. May 24th, John Brown, who'd been here for about 6 months, committed his worst act. I always say the one that is the most indefensible, when he killed 5 pro-slavery settlers on Pottawatomie Creek, called the Pottawatomie Massacre. Brown was making a statement, and the statement was free staters were going to stand up and pro-slavery people need to get out. He did scare out of everybody. a week later, they actually caught up with him near Baldwin City, Kansas. And Brown really showed us what he was made of because he had a chance to surrender. He actually went out with a white flag to surrender. And when the Missourian Henry Clay Pate came over to Brown, he thought they were going to be chivalrous. And Brown pulled his revolver and put it to his head and said, "I'm not surrendering, you are." And that's where we realized John Brown's going to fight to the end, no matter what the end is. I love when they caught Brown in 1859. Somebody said to Brown, "Are there any more in Kansas like you?" He meant business. He's a complicated person. Frederick Douglass praised him. I love his stance, but at the same time, of course, he goes too far. So these events are all happening. But here's the part, and now I can kind of transition to this. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about. John Brown wasn't just committing violence. John Brown wasn't just saying things. And I always tell my students, John Brown was a 56-year-old man. He'd had a life. John Brown was also working on the Underground Railroad. And what happens in 1856 is that John Brown starts figuring out who else can help him and will help him. And I could name like 10 names. I'll say a few of them as we go along. But he realizes there's 4 or 5 men that will assist him in freeing slaves. Now, here's their challenge. Do they only go to Kansas locations to try to do this? And here's where Kansas is different than the East Coast or the East. In the East, it's pretty much run away, and then we'll help. Run away, then we'll help. What's different about Brown, John Stewart, Charles Linhart, Richard Cordley, is they make a decision to go get them. Like they can't get away. And so they're going to go to plantations and say, and break a door, run, jump in my wagon. So they're going to be very much more involved. And just so I don't forget it, we believe 300 slaves were rescued by this group, this larger group. It's a lot than that. I'm going to hit on a few here. I'm just going to tell you some quick stories here. This is Party Butler. Party Butler lived in Atchison County, Kansas. Since I work at Friends, one of my friend's bosses even said this the other day. She said, "You need to tell that story about those Quakers." So I'll tell you the story about these Quakers. What makes the Quakers doing this in this moment unique is, as you all know, they were pacifist, supposedly. And I want to say, they weren't pacifist in Kansas. They might have been pacifist in name, but because they got involved, and when they had to defend themselves, they did defend themselves. So anyway, this is Party Butler, and he was very involved. And the pro-slavery Missourians, because of his proximity to them, at one point finally came over. They threatened him one day. Then they left him alone for a little while. They came back and actually captured him. Didn't kill him, but they beat him up, put him on a raft. And this little flag right here, which it says Eastern Aid Express, they thought they'd put him on this raft and he wouldn't survive. But anyway, they put him out on the Missouri River to die. He survived. A group after that called the Party Quakers joined John Brown. So he inspired a bunch of people. Another individual that I admire very much is a minister from Lawrence named Richard Cordley. Richard Cordley, I love this quote. Isn't this a great quote? "It's easy to be brave 1,000 miles away." He was getting a little tired of people on the East Coast telling Kansans what to do. And he said, "It's easy to be brave 1,000 miles away, but now I must face the question at short range. I felt there was only one thing to do." What he's talking about is that I'm ready to go be physical about it and go help and go rescue them. And then Jim Lane. And Jim Lane will become our first United States Senator. This is a Democrat that became a Republican. There's a great debate about that. But even though he's wacky in so many ways, he's also great in many ways. This is the man who was involved in the Underground Railroad. This is the man who was the first person to advocate for African Americans in uniform and made it happen. So he did a lot of good, even if he had some challenges at times. Very charismatic. So Jim Lane, John Brown, Richard Cordley, Charles Linhart, and several others made this idea of a route out of Kansas real. And here is the route. So as a historian, I want more signs put up just so we remember where these things are. I think now there's only one sign. I'll have a picture of it up here in a minute. But Brown went to Iowa, and because here's the deal. They decided they can't go through Missouri. They're going to get stopped. So Brown said, let's do this. Let's go north. They basically went to Nebraska City or a little beyond, and then we'll turn right and go east into Iowa. So they located some Iowans to help them, and they had a process. Lane also had the idea for markers that they would burn a handful of chimneys. So you go north till you see a chimney. That's a rescue space. That's somebody who can help you. By the way, the Missourians caught on to this and tried to actually run up and down the Lane Trail fighting them, and did take some slaves. Sometimes the slaves would take off on their own. Missourians grabbed them. That did happen. So this is called the Lane Trail. And they said you could see it by the chimneys. And anyway, there it is. It goes to Topeka, to Holton, to Sabetha, and then on up into Nebraska, and then across Iowa. From Iowa, Canada. That was the plan. This is the larger picture of the Underground Railroad. And like I said, in many cases, our story has been kind of forgotten. But it's interesting. This is in a lot of textbooks. And I do think it's interesting. You can kind of see the line that they are trying to depict that Kansans were trying to help route them through and around. But it also, sometimes we forget they were going to Canada. And you can see all those Canadian spots there. Yeah, this is the one marker that's still out there. The Lane Trail. It tells a little bit about it. Several of these towns now are gone. They're ghost towns that once existed. What's that? This one? This one's it's north of Holton. And I forget the exact, but it's a few miles north of Holton. So let me tell you a couple quick stories as I start to bring this down, because there's a couple of just incredible stories. This was the first official rescue north on the Lane Trail. 1857, so 56 was a lot of violence. 1857, they tried to take a woman named Ann Clark. Most of the time we don't know names. 99% of the time we know no names. We know some stories. But this particular time, it was recorded that this started originally with a woman named Ann Clark, who was a runaway. They added 3 or 4 more. This is also, on this trip, these guys hid them. They had figured out ways to hide them underneath the wagon. They created basically, it's like you hear about later in the railroad hobo days about these different spaces that people would climb into. They created almost like a shelf underneath the wagon that they could climb into and stay away from them, that did work. But anyway, they got stopped at one point by border ruffians, but they were able to continue the journey and got her all the way to Iowa. Like I said, by 1858 and 1859, the Missouri border ruffians were tracking the Lane Trail. Slave patrols, slave hunters were prevalent. Kansas hadn't gotten decided yet the way it would. And this story is a pretty famous Kansas story. A physician by the name of Dr. John Doy led the rescue of 13 slaves. They actually ended up with 25 in the group. And they were going to escort them north on the Lane Trail. And Doy was ambushed about 12 miles from Lawrence. He was stopped. It was him and his son, by the way. It was John and Charles. And they had all these runaways. They were ambushed about 12 miles from Lawrence, taken into custody. They and the slaves were taken to Weston to jail. They had like a nonsense trial. Doy was sentenced to the penitentiary, the Missouri State Penitentiary. This is, again, it's a white man who's sentenced to the Missouri Penitentiary. This is where the story gets really interesting. They actually let his son off after a short time, but John Doy was to be first in jail and then to the penitentiary. Before he could be relocated to the penitentiary, some of the Free Staters, abolitionists in Kansas, said, let's try to go get him. This is the Bleeding Kansas period, and it's getting really busy. And so it's called the story of the Immortal 10. They went to Weston, and when they were transferring John Doy out, these Immortal 10 jumped him and got Doy and took off in a heck of a chase after bluffing their way in and around the jail. And this is the photograph. We have a photograph of these. That's the Immortal 10. These guys are all, it's a great Kansas photograph. This is 1859. Doy is seated in a chair. He didn't have the strength to stand. He's not been eating. And so there's 3 or 4 of these. This is ID'd too. We know who every one of these guys is. And 2 of my favorite people in history are right here. These 2. That's a guy named John Stewart, who we know quite a bit about his working on the Underground Railroad, and even after that in the Civil War. And then the guy to his left is a man named Silas Soule. That's a whole other talk. But it's a great story. 2 great people, seriously. I mean, people who had a conscience and were concerned about their fellow man. Strong believers. They call John Stewart, who you just saw. In fact, I'll tell you one real quick thing. 5 or 6 of these guys are preachers, which is pretty fascinating. Men who 5 years earlier said, we're not going to use violence. That episode of Bleeding Kansas had changed their opinions. And here's another picture of Stewart, and I'm going to kind of go here towards the end. Couple things. The question might come up, who rescued the most? John Stewart rescued 68 by his count. John Stewart also said we should never forget the role of women. He said women were helping all the time. And he also cited his own wife. This is something his wife wrote. This is a preacher and a preacher's wife. And she wrote at one point, I would burn every slaveholder up. I believe, husband, it'd be right for you to shoot them. That's just hard to imagine, but that's how tense the situation is. John Brown's last moment in Kansas territory happened when he led a rescue near Holton and was briefly detained, and it turned into a bit of a skirmish called the Battle of the Spurs. After that, Brown went back east, grew the longer beard, and we know died at Harper's Ferry, or was apprehended at Harper's Ferry. Also at the end, a couple of interesting things at the very end. One is that William Quantrell, the later famous raider, he played both sides. At one point, he led Free Staters on a slave rescue, which was a trap. It's called the Morgan Walker raid. He walked them right in to be killed. Bad guy. Another group, which was in southeast Kansas, is called the Secret Danites, also kind of a Quaker community. And then a story, of course, no one's ever heard, Native Americans. Native Americans were split by the conflict also. The Creek tribe, in particular, was split almost right down the middle. There were what we call Union Creek, who did not own slaves and did not think it appropriate, and there were slave-owning Creek. The Union Creek were led by an Indian named Opatle Yahola. That's a Kansan, by the way. This man led his band of Union Creek from Oklahoma to Kansas. He was trying to get to Fort Scott. He went at the worst time. He was running from Confederate Creek, fighting his own people. And he went at the worst time in 1861 during the winter. It's called the Trail of Blood and Ice. They had all these men, women, and children. It's almost like a mini Trail of Tears trying to get out of Oklahoma. Several of them died near today's Fredonia, and they were trying to get to Fort Scott. This man was born in 1778. So when this occurred, he was 85 years old, leading his people out of Oklahoma. It's an incredible story. That led later on to Kansas being the first state that had Native Americans fight in the war. We had the first African American regiment. We had the first Native American regiment, just not talked about. Pretty great story. Lastly, and I'll kind of end here, and if you guys have time or if you have questions, I just didn't want to go too far. About 300 were rescued, and I want to tell you about this photograph right here. So we don't know their names. I would tell you in the stories of all the rescues, we know like 10 names. But this photograph was taken, and it was written on this photograph that this was a woman who was rescued, and we don't know her name. And historians have talked about her a lot. She's dressed quite nicely. More than likely, this is as they're getting ready to say goodbye to her. This would be our guess. Some people even think this was taken in Iowa before the Iowa to Canada move. She's also got on a wedding ring, which is also super interesting for that time because it was hard to come by for everybody. But she, to me, in many ways, she speaks to the, thousands that we'll never know. So all that to say, Kansas has a heritage to be proud of, and especially in relationship to the Underground Railroad And of course, you all know we came in as a free state. A lot of battle, but we finally came in as a free state on January 29th, 1861. So yeah, we're on the 164th this week. I got to be in Topeka on Wednesday at the State House, actually because of my film, for our film. But it was interesting, and I'll end with this. I thought it was interesting in the State House just to see all the different hubs of things happening. I know for you guys, that's all, you're used to some of that. But I thought it was cool because it being on Kansas Day, there were some people commemorating our role in women's suffrage over here. There were some people over here commemorating the role of African Americans over here. There's a new mural up. I just thought that was neat seeing all those different hubs. I love that about Kansas, and I love that about our story too. So thank you guys.
Anybody have any questions?
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I've got a historic question tied into this part of your presentation. Some Brits have made the comment that they abolished slavery in the 1830s before we did, but I've made the argument that under the Articles of Confederation and the Confederated Congress that preceded it, that when the Northwest Territories were organized before the U.S. Constitution was adopted, by the way, that action was the first time in world history that slavery had been abolished in any jurisdiction, as far as I'm aware. Are you aware of any other jurisdictions that had abolished slavery prior to the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s?
No, you're probably right. That's probably the first time that I can remember. It's sad we didn't do it on a national level, but yeah, the Articles or Northwest Ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance is the first place in America that it's banned like that. Bans it from 5 future states. And you're like you said, it's the summer of the same year of the Constitution. So no, I don't think there's anybody that precedes that. The question my students will have sometimes is, why didn't we? We were already growing apart by that point. The states were growing apart. The institution was growing apart. It's a part of a larger conversation. It had so much taken a hold of the economic elements of the South that it was going to be a battle. But that's a great point, Carl.
You mentioned chimneys marking the trail.
Yeah.
What kind of chimneys?
I don't know, all kinds. I read descriptions of them. I don't know that I have a photograph.
Freestanding?
Freestanding. Freestanding. Yeah, that's a good question. Freestanding, yeah.
Okay.
But you do read descriptions of them and little ways they could try to mark it. Stone.
Debate here. Was there a single event or maybe a couple of events that kind of polarized everybody, kind of pulled out, have Quakers converted over to having to do something? Was there a single event, maybe 1 or 2 events that kind of convinced everybody, okay, it's no longer acceptable to just try to do this politically, we've got to do something else?
That's a great question. One event, the elections the elections. I think even with the elections, people went, what is going on? And the fact that nobody could restore order. And the raiding of a town, where in America was a town being raided and burned down? So I don't know if there's one, but there's certainly a series of events. If I go back to Christian Isley that I wrote my book about, I told you his family were Democrats, they were peace Democrats. By October of 61, he's writing letters arguing with his family in Ohio because they're like, stay out of it. It's Lincoln's problem. And here's what happened that finally changed him. He said, I saw all those things. He certainly had his wife telling him, you better get after it. And then the last event for him was they lived in St. Joe. And the county courthouse had changed flags about 5 times. And suddenly he said he went out on his porch one morning and there were Union soldiers in his town, United States soldiers in his town. He said, I walked over to him and I said, where are you boys from? And one of them said, Ohio. Christian went back inside and wrote a letter or wrote a journal entry where he said, that's it. People are traveling to protect me. So I'll be protecting myself from now on. So I feel like that's some of it too. I'm going to protect myself at this point. You're coming after my stuff. Slave owners said you're coming after our property, but free staters were saying, yeah, you're coming after mine. We are the only state that was born in conflict, in my opinion. And I think that and our independence, even here, we see our independence which is so significant. It makes us unique. Makes Kansans, Kansans are odd ducks. Let's be honest. And the best way, I think, we're kind of our own breed. So anyway, that's, yeah.
Appreciate your talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I am reading The Jefferson Lies by David Barton. There's a lot of conjecture, and he does a great job of documenting a lot of that. George Washington emancipated his slaves upon his death in 1799 and was able to do that because the Virginia legislature allowed that at that time. Jefferson inherited the bulk of his slaves when he was 14 years old, about 187 of them, and the Virginia legislature changed that law. And in those days, if a person wanted to emancipate their slaves, they had to financially provide for them for their lifetime. And he simply, most of it was economically driven. And it's a fascinating thing. But there were also black folks that fought in the war for independence as well.
Sure.
But I guess y'all grew up different than I did. One thing he mentioned in that book as well, Democrats never controlled Congress until 1820.
Yeah, Federalist. We don't want to have a Washington Jefferson debate today, but I'm a Washington guy. I love Jefferson. Don't get me wrong, I love Jefferson. But Washington actually, that theory that they had to take care of him, Washington's the one that actually hurts that theory because he did free all of his slaves. You could free all your slaves. There was the idea of what you're saying, though. The idea of taking care of them. I get that. But Washington freed all his slaves. Washington's the only founding father that did free all his slaves. I understand, yeah. But I'm saying Washington lived in Virginia, too. And he freed them 27 years earlier. Jefferson wrote time and time again. Jefferson wrote in the 1770s he thought slavery was an abomination. But in 1820, he was still living when they did the Missouri Compromise. And listen to this quote. It tells you everything you need to know about Jefferson. He said, it's like having a wolf by its ears. Slavery is like having a wolf by its ears. You know you need to let go, but you're not sure how. That's the answer to the question. He knows it's got to go away, but he's not sure how to pull it off. And I would say that Washington and Lincoln, and Washington, one thing I admire about Washington so much is he didn't say much about it, but he freed 290. He did it on his death, but at some point you just got to do it. And you got to say it's a moral evil and I've got to do it. But I mean, it's a tough one because there's so much good about Jefferson. You know what I mean? So I struggle with it too. But I admire George so much for what he did. Sorry, too long of an answer.
If you go to Western Kansas, you see small towns every 30 miles. If you go to Hayes, if you go 30 miles, McKinley, and then Clinton, Cody, and if you go north, you go to Hill City. And every 30 miles there's a small town. Do you know why it's like that? I know.
Why it's like that?
Small towns every 30 miles.
I mean, there were a lot of towns, but I don't know if you.
What I heard is that they used to go by house.
Oh yeah.
Bogey, and every 30 miles they have to rest.
Yeah.
And that's how small towns started. Every 30 miles.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Survival. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For survival on the trails.
Any last questions?
How would you characterize slavery in Spain and the Spanish Empire? Obviously, Spain was illegal long before the United States was founded, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what that was the situation you had on the ground. Spain couldn't control what was going on in California or Monterey.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting what Carl said about even the Northwest Ordinance. I'm thinking about that, Malcolm. Spain's view of slavery was much harsher than ours before, and after. I don't know if you know that they were still holding on after the United States. How would I characterize it? They were probably more united in their defense of slavery than the United States was. We were always at odds about it from the founding on. was, I don't know what else I can say about it. You know, one of the challenges to me, if I think about the founding of the United States, is slavery was not we didn't bring it as a country. It's just that we didn't deal with it.
We've got one last question.
Yeah, the Declaration of Independence, instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I understand they wanted life, liberty, and property.
Right.
But
Yeah.
because slaves were property, they didn't want to put property in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. From property to pursuit of happiness. That's exactly correct. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you very much. See you next week.